Welcome back to Human Biology with Dr. B. Today we are covering the respiratory system, which seems much simpler than it actually is. So, let's talk about it. Breathing. This is the main thing that we recognize our respiratory system to do. Very important. Air comes in, air comes out. That's pretty much how it works. Well, it is a little bit more complicated than that, as we'll see today. First, we inhale oxygen. And then we exhale carbon dioxide. This is not only related to our lungs, but it has everything to do with every single cell performing cellular respiration, which is our cells taking in oxygen, burning glucose, using it as energy, and releasing carbon dioxide. So there's four major processes in respiration. Number one, breathing, ventilating. There it is, breathing and ventilating. The second one is external respiration. We're going to learn the difference between external and internal respiration in just a moment. We have some gas transport happening, and then we have internal respiration. So a little bit of a deeper look at these. So breathing, this is typically what we think of for our respiratory system, just moving air in and out of the lungs, expanding and contracting the rib cage. External respiration, however, is the actual physical exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood. This occurs at the level of the alveoli. And then we have gas transport. Gas transport allows the oxygen and carbon dioxide to move between the lungs and the body tissues. So we breathe air in with our nose, with our upper respiratory system, deep inside our lungs at the alveolar level. Oxygen is exchanged for carbon dioxide. Then at the gas transport level, this occurs in the blood, right outside of the lungs. And then we have internal respiration, and this occurs at the tissue level. So we move all the way from the external portion of the body all the way down to every single cell and every single tissue in our body. That's respiration, not just breathing. It's all the way from the external portion of your body all the way down to your tissues. So we have two regions of the respiratory system. We have the upper and the lower. The upper respiratory system is everything that you typically think of when you get a cold. Your nose, your sinuses, your pharynx, your larynx. This is what allows us to talk. We'll talk more about each of these in a moment. And then we have the lower respiratory system. The lower respiratory system is what allows for both internal and external respiration. The ability of moving air from the external portion, something outside of us, into our bodies. This includes the larynx, the epiglottis, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and all the way down to the lungs. So the upper respiratory system. Let's talk about the nose for a second. Now, the nose doesn't really seem all that complicated, but it's really important to note that it is divided into two categories. Two categories, one side and then the other, the right and the left. We have two nasal cavities. These are covered with a mucous membrane. If we remember from a previous discussion that we've had, a mucous membrane is soft and sticky and is covered with, wait for it, mucus. This allows for any debris in the air, any small particles that you might not necessarily see, but they're there to get trapped before they move all the way down to your lungs. This actually helps us stay healthy, prevents pneumonia, prevents a lot of diseases. So what does it do? Well, the first thing that it does, as we talked about, is it cleans the air. The mucous membrane and the cilia are really, really important for this. It also warms and moistens the air. So we live in Colorado Springs, about 7,000 feet in elevation. It's very dry. There's not a lot of oxygen up here. So have you ever wondered why you wake up in the morning and you have all these boogers? I mean, have you ever actually thought about that? I think about that all the time because I find it extraordinarily annoying. So the reason why at elevations and drier climates where you will get more boogers and you need to blow your nose more often and nosebleeds as well, is because the whole purpose of that mucous membrane is to warm and moisten the air. So when there's less moisture in the air, that means that in order for the air to be properly conditioned before it gets to your lungs, it takes out more moisture from your mucous membranes. And this is what produces boogers. You're welcome. Our nose also allows for our sense of smell. So we also have our sinuses. So when we think of our sinuses, we primarily think of a cold. Everything here in the front part of your face, you can see on this picture, we see her frontal sinus, your ethmoid sinus, sphenoid just behind that, and then your maxillary. So what exactly are sinuses? When I typically think of sinuses, I think of my actual nose, but that's not what the sinus is. So a sinus infection or anything associated with your sinus is actually these air pockets in your bones. Did you know that you are actually an airhead? I think that's so funny. There are these pockets in the bones that are created that to have air in them to both lighten the head, because if it was solid bone, your head would weigh a lot more than it does, and your neck would get tired, and all of these things would happen. But the main thing that they do is they're connected to the nasal cavities, and they allow, especially right here with the ethmoid and sphenoid, these bones have, they're called the nasal concha, and they're shaped like conch shells. And they're lined with this wonderful mucous membrane that helps warm and condition and moisturize the air before it gets to your lungs. This is also where your olfactory epithelium is that allows for your sense of smell. So the function, as we talked about, we're going to lighten your head. So it's not solid bone all the way through. We're going to warm and moisten the air. And if you've ever had a cold, you've noticed that your voice changes, because if you plug your nose and you don't allow air into the sinuses, then you don't have this wonderful resonating quality that allows your voice to carry. And let's talk about sinusitis. Sinusitis is basically what we call hashtag the common cold. It's any type of inflammation of the mucous membranes of the sinuses, and this can be caused not only by a cold, it's typically caused by the rhinovirus, but it can very easily be caused by allergies. So let's talk about the pharynx and larynx. Let's move a little bit farther down. We've talked about the nose, we've talked about the sinuses. Let's talk about how we talk and how we don't swallow through our air hole. I just said that. So the pharynx, this is your throat. This is just behind your nose and your mouth. This is not only your passageway for air, but it is also your passageway for food and drink. This is also connected to the middle ear, which we talked about in a previous lecture about the sensory systems. So the middle ear is what we call the eustachian tubes, and it's connected to the eustachian tubes to allow for equalization. When you move to different elevations or down to sea level, or there's more pressure around you, this allows equalization between the external atmospheric pressure and the internal atmospheric pressure in your sinuses. Your larynx is the voice box. So men around the voice box typically will have what we call an Adam's apple, and that's a bone just over it that allows for and helps the voice with its resonant quality. This is also the entrance to the lower respiratory system, and this is how we talk. I love these pictures over here. You can see very easily. So here's the larynx. You can see the epiglottis. The epiglottis is this large cartilaginous structure that will cover the windpipe when you swallow, so that anything that goes in your mouth that is of a liquid or a food nature does not go into your windpipe. And then you can look down, we have a cartoon of it. You can see the vocal cords. These are also cartilaginous, and they rub together almost in the same way that a cricket rubs its legs together to make that chirping sound that we so love on warm summer nights. And this is an actual picture of the vocal cords. You can see them open and you can see them closed here. During speech, as I mentioned, they are stretched out as air passes through them, and the vibrations is what allows for different tones in your voice. So then we get to the lower respiratory system, and we start with the trachea. The trachea is lined with these wonderful, healthy cilia that, as we've talked about in our previous discussion of various types of cells, the cilia have what we call a power stroke. It is very similar to how one does the freestyle when you swim. The cilia comes forward in the pushing movement and then slowly, or not slowly, but more passively contracts, and then the power stroke and then contracts. The trachea has this wonderful tube shape to it. and it's held open by these C-shaped rings of cartilage. It's very important that the trachea stays open because the only way we move air in and out of the lungs is with a pressure differential. Now, a pressure differential on something that was not held open by a strong structure, such as cartilage, would simply collapse under the pressure. And the whole purpose of the trachea is to move air from the nose, from the pharynx, down through the larynx, and then we get to the trachea, and then down into the bronchioles and the lungs. So the goal is to move air from external to internally. The bronchial tree, this is such a beautiful picture. You can see the trachea would end right about here. We come down, and then we branch into the right and left primary bronchi. And then from there, they branch into this wonderful tree, and at the end of each of these branches of the tree is what we would call an alveolar sac. And it's at the level of the alveolar sac that air is moved, oxygen is moved from inside the lungs into the blood. So the lower respiratory system, the alveoli, they are these grape-like sacs. They look just like this, and you can see around each of the alveoli we have both a venous and an arterial supply. Now keep in mind, we just finished talking about the heart. So when the heart pumps from the blood moving from the heart to the lungs, moves in what we call the pulmonary artery. It's the only artery in your body that carries deoxygenated blood or less oxygenated blood. So you can see here that it comes in the blue and then is removed in the red. This will then go back to the heart and be pumped to the body. So you can see here each alveoli is only one cell thick. So there's literally only two cells, the cell of the capillary and the cell of the alveoli, that separates the atmospheric oxygen in the lungs and the blood. And it's that pressure differential that allows the oxygen to be moved into and the carbon dioxide out of. So oxygen diffuses into the blood, carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveolar air, and then it is exhaled. So how do you actually breathe? We've had a lot of talk about this pressure differential. So let's talk about it. Now, typically, not a lot of thought goes into breathing, which is great because it's necessary and you need to continue doing it, even when you're asleep. So the only way that air moves into the lungs and then is expelled out is by this pressure differential. Now, if you've ever had a drink and used a straw, you have experienced a pressure differential. If you have ever gone up in a plane or changed elevations in the car, you've experienced a pressure differential. Now, when you suck fluid through a straw, you are actually decreasing the pressure in your mouth, and due to the decreasing pressure in your mouth, the fluid is sucked into the straw and into your mouth. The same principle is true in your lungs. Inhalation is what happens when you pull air in to your lungs. This occurs when the diaphragm, which is this huge muscle, it goes all the way through your thoracic cavity. It is bound here at the posterior portion of your ribs and then here on the anterior portion as well. Now, during inhalation, the diaphragm, which is a skeletal muscle, contracts and pulls down. Now, when the diaphragm contracts, it creates a negative pressure in the lungs and air is drawn in. This is an active process and can be changed based on, you can physically change your breathing rate by just contracting and expanding your diaphragm. You can think about it and you can do it. Or your body takes over and does it on its own. Now, exhalation is passive. It's the relaxation of the diaphragm. So during inhalation, the diaphragm is pulled down. During exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes and is pulled up. It's pulled up because of the pressure differential. Because the pressure, as the lung pushes out, as the air is pushed out, increases the pressure. So we decrease the pressure, draw the air in, and then once inhalation is complete, the diaphragm relaxes and increases the pressure, pushes it out. So the intercostal muscles as well. So the intercostal muscles, what are these? These are the muscles in between each of the ribs. They play a role in inhalation and exhalation as well. The intercostal muscles will relax, and then the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases. Air will then move out of the lungs because the pressure in the lungs is much greater than that in the air. So it's basically a push and a pull. So the diaphragm pulls down, contracts to pull the air in, decreasing the pressure, drawing the air in, and then when the diaphragm relaxes, it increases the pressure and physically pushes the air out. So let's talk about gas transport. We have 3 different levels of gas transport. We have external respiration, and this occurs at the level of the alveoli. Now, at the level of the alveoli, you can see here in external respiration that in the alveoli, this is where the air is drawn in from the environment, and there's the 1 cell thick of the alveolar wall and the 1 cell thick of the capillary. And it's across this membrane that gas transport occurs. So external respiration is just this occurring in the alveoli. Oxygen diffuses into the blood, carbon dioxide diffuses out. Then we have gas transport by the blood. This is the second level. Gas transport is where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged within the blood. And then we have internal respiration. Internal respiration occurs at the level of the tissues, where oxygen moves into the tissues and carbon dioxide diffuses out. This actually occurs on a concentration gradient. So wherever oxygen is needed, wherever oxygen concentration is the lowest, oxygen will move into that area because, as we talked about, diffusion goes from a higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Think of a slide. It goes from the area of high to the area of low. And it is a natural process. It occurs without any effort. It just naturally, the oxygen diffuses in and the carbon dioxide diffuses out. There is help by the hemoglobin within the blood, as we talked about in a previous lecture. So how do we control respiration? We have 2 levels of control. We have chemical and neural. The neural control occurs at the brainstem level, both the medulla and the pons. We have the apneustic, say that 10 times fast, and the pneumotaxic centers. And these control the breathing rate without you thinking about it. It is automatic. You don't even have to think about it. And the pattern of breathing, however, can be voluntarily altered. Like if I decided that I wanted to hyperventilate, I can do that. It might make me feel a little lightheaded at the moment because I'm blowing off all that carbon dioxide. However, I can have voluntary control over my breathing rate. And if I choose not to, then you know what? My brain takes over and I don't even have to think about it. Now, fun fact, children, especially when they're 2, oh Lord, the 2-year-olds, when they get really mad, sometimes they can hold their breath, especially tiny babies. They'll like catch their breath for a second and you'll worry about like, are you ever going to breathe again? But the brain will take over in that instance. The brain doesn't ever stop breathing. So if your kid gets really mad and decides to hold it, I'm just going to hold my breath. And then you can be like, well, okay, your brain will take over. So, I mean, you can voluntarily only hold your breath for a short period of time before your brain says, hey, guess what? I'm going to need some oxygen, and then takes over. So the chemical control of respiration, obviously we have the carbon dioxide and the oxygen. So carbon dioxide is the most influential factor in the breathing rate. As the carbon dioxide increases, it will actually cause the breathing rate to increase. The breathing rate is how many breaths you take in a minute. This is controlled by chemoreceptors that are in the medulla oblongata, again, at the level of the brain, the aortic bodies in the aortic arch, if you can see this right here. And then we also have carotid bodies, which are here in the carotid artery. Now we have bodies, all of these chemoreceptors in the aortic arch, because this is what serves the majority of the body. All the blood that goes to the body passes through the aortic arch. And then we also have some here in the carotid artery because, hey, guess what? Your brain is kind of important. Without a fully oxygenated brain, well, guess what? You won't be able to breathe. I mean, it's a circular thought right there. And then we have oxygen. Now, this seems a little counterintuitive, but oxygen does in fact not affect the breathing rate unless it gets to incredibly low levels. Incredibly low levels, like you're about to die. It's the carbon dioxide that becomes a massive problem when it builds up in the tissues. Again, the chemoreceptors in the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies can sense the oxygen level as well. Now, how is respiration controlled? So the first thing that controls the respiration is the level of carbon dioxide. Now, as carbon dioxide increases, this also provides for an increased acidity, which is the hydrogen ion concentration. And when this happens, it's so cool the way that our blood and hemoglobin works. As the carbon dioxide levels rise, so does the acidity. Now, the pH level, the hydrogen ion concentration, as it increases, will actually help hemoglobin change shape to release oxygen faster, so that the carbon dioxide levels come down, the oxygen levels rise. What happens next is the carbon dioxide level increases in the cerebrospinal fluid. When this happens, you know there's a problem. This is then sensed by chemoreceptors in the medulla, as well as when the carbon dioxide increases, the hydrogen ion concentration increases, and this is then also sensed in the aortic and carotid bodies, which will then feed back to the medulla and say, hey, medulla oblongata, I need you to increase the respiration rate so I don't pass out. And what happens is the breathing rate is increased, more carbon dioxide is blown off, and the carbon dioxide levels return to normal. This is also a wonderful example of a feedback inhibition system in our body. And once carbon dioxide levels return to normal, guess what? Homeostasis is restored. So, quick and dirty lecture. After this, you should now be able to discuss the main processes associated with respiration, describe the main structures and the respective functions of the upper and lower respiratory tract structures. You should be able to differentiate between internal and external respiration, and explain how the breathing rate is affected by various neural and chemical controls. Thanks so much for joining me. This has been another lecture with Dr. B.